Welcome to the Mind of Business Success podcast. I'm your host, Alicia Kramer. Today we have with us Bron Williams. She is a bias specialist. Now, we have to start there because someone is saying, what does that even mean? So tell us about what you do and explain to us what that means.
Thank you, Alicia. And I'm glad you've asked me that because I had someone from the United States yesterday say to me, oh, the bias specialist, sounds like you think bias is a wonderful thing. And so I will unpack that because over the next 30 minutes, I'm going to show you and your listeners why they haven't yet found that silver bullet, the one that is actually impacting their decision making, because it's just decision making that holds us back in so many ways in business. How does bias and decision making match up? Well, I became the bias specialist because I had a personal journey with bias, and I started to see that there were things happening in my thinking underneath the surface that were at odds with what was going on logically. Roger J. Davies says that our biases operate in a parallel world to rational and logical thought processes. And I love that idea. I like fantasy, things like The Matrix, that idea of parallel worlds. And that's what our biases sit on one side and our logical thought sits on the other. So bias is just the privileging of one set of ideas or one group of people against another, and often to the detriment of another set of ideas or another group of people. And bias forms unconsciously in childhood from lots of different areas of input, like your family. If you're part of a faith group, even nationality. I'm an Aussie, I have a particular worldview. People in the US will have a slightly different worldview. Even our sporting teams, the media, have lots of input into our lives, and they shape how we see the world, how we see ourselves, how we see our relationships, the decisions we make, who we trust, who we innately dismiss.
How does that affect business?
Well, because we have biases that influence our thinking and our decision making. It's the decision making that is key. We make decisions often thinking, I have an objective outlook on this. I've looked at all the options. I'm going to have make an objective decision. But we don't realise that we have other ways of thinking, these unconscious biases that are sitting there just below the surface, and they're influencing those decisions. So it might be a person's height or weight. We can have biases around, fat people are lazy. We might have biases around age, and I think most people will have felt that. You start out in business, you're too young. What would you know? You get to my end of the age spectrum, you're too old. You're obviously not up to date. How do you know about technology? So we make assumptions about what people can and can't do, whether they'd be an appropriate business partner, whether they might have the skills necessary. And when it comes to promotions, we might think, well, this person went to the same sort of school as I did, therefore they must be the right sort of person to move into leadership, whereas we're wary of, say, someone who has a different skin colour because we don't understand their culture.
From a business owner's perspective, challenging our own biases is extremely important. Now, as a mindset person myself, I'm working with my clients constantly on those bias conditions, right? The In some cases, they are consciously aware of them, and in many cases, they're not, and they are influencing their decisions. I remember when I turned 30, thinking to myself, finally, people are going to take me more seriously. And it seems like it's not that big of a deal, but what does that do to someone when they're not what they think they need to be in order to be successful? It becomes an extremely self-limiting, self-destructive belief. So how are you helping your clients to identify these unconscious biases? And then what do you do when you find out what's really going on at those deeper levels of the mind?
Good. I'll share a personal journey with this. I am 65. I started this business when I was 60, after a lifetime of education, not for profit, because I still had something else that I needed to get done in this final third of my life. However, I was confronted with my own ageist biases. What is a woman who is 60 doing, starting a business? Don't you know you're supposed to be retiring now? You know, you're too old to be doing this. You don't have enough formal skills in a particular area, or you don't have enough business acumen. It was particularly the age, that ageist bias, and here is where having a good business coach or mentor, it's been for me such a key, because we all need to learn from other people and have other people draw things out from us. She just kept saying, age is merely a number, age is merely a number, until I believed it. But I had to confront that. So it doesn't matter what end of the age spectrum, we can be our own worst enemies. So how can we identify biases? Well, I have a 4-step process. First of all is to notice the triggers, and I will use my own story that I've just shared with you. The triggers that I were noticing was this story, this narrative in my head about I'm grey-haired, you know, I've got wrinkles, I'm menopausal, all of those things. I'm going, I'm too old, I'm too old, I'm too old to be doing this. And I noticed myself being triggered by how I looked, that number in that, you know, because I have no control over how long I've been on this earth, but that number kept triggering me. And that is the key, is to notice what is triggering us, and often what is triggering us over and over and over again. And then the second step, it's important not to overlook the triggers. Don't just write them off. Don't just push them aside and say it doesn't matter, because they do matter. The second step is to then think, well, what are the stories? Oh no, ask the questions. That's the next question, is ask the questions. I'm jumping steps here. Ask the questions. And the question I needed to ask myself is, well, why? Why is this age any worse than any other age? Why do I think that being 60 is too old to be doing something? So questions are key when it comes to working with biases. So triggers, questions, then come the stories or the narratives. What are the narratives that you're believing, the stories that are flowing around and around in our brains that we keep telling ourselves around this? And for me, as the eldest of 3 siblings, where the other 2 have already retired or moved into semi-retirement, my story was that in my family, we retire at, or we slow down and work at, this particular age. And that was my family story around what is appropriate at an age. So then I was able to finally recognise my bias, my ageist bias, which I was using against myself. How silly is that? To use a bias against myself to prevent myself from moving forward. So once we've done that, we've noticed the triggers, we've asked the questions, we've identified the stories, we've then be able to give a name to the bias. Then we get to choose, because that bias is no longer unconscious. We get to choose, what do I do with this bias, with this story that I've been telling myself? And for me, it was almost like I just had to own that this was my bias, this was my story, because then it was like, okay, I can just leave that now. Yes, I am the age I am. As I said, I have no control over how long I've been on this earth, but I get to choose what I get to do with the next third of my life.
What you just shared is extremely valuable. And I really hope that our listeners did not miss that, because that is the same process that we can take ourselves through with any of our limiting beliefs. We have to look at what is really going on and see it for what it really is. A lot of people feel the trigger and they're not willing to look at it, to look at what their beliefs are around that. Because oftentimes there's two conflicting points of view. There's the program in there that usually comes from somewhere else, someone else that got conditioned into us, and that feels off to us. And then we've heard something, or we intuitively know it to be different than that belief. But what happens is you feel triggered about something, and then you say to yourself, oh, but I don't believe that. Completely disregarding the fact that, yeah, on some level you do, friend, which is why you're being triggered. And so we push it away. Now, the problem with that is it seems like that would be a valid solution, right? Just don't give it any thought. Don't give it any consideration. Just push it away. But when it keeps getting triggered, that means you have not resolved the issue. There's still a negative emotional charge on that belief, whether you want to accept that it's in your subconscious mind or not. And unless and until you actually are willing to see it for what it really is and challenge it, which is a part of the process that you just explained, see how irrational it really is, then the part of the mind that's holding on to that as being some sort of truth for you, you dismantle it. And when you unravel the emotional pull of that belief, when you see it for what it really is, now you can actually make an empowered decision. There's a difference between pushing something away and making an empowered decision. I don't need to believe that. That's not serving me. And in that moment, now you can legitimately let it go. You can legitimately make a different choice.
Absolutely. And I know at a business level, my business took off in an exponential curve the moment I addressed that bias. That's why I call this the silver bullet for business, because these biases, our unconscious mindsets, are there all the time. And as you say, if we don't pay attention to the triggers, and they're often the same ones over and over again, if we don't pay attention to them, it doesn't matter how successful we get in other areas, this area will hold us back. And I'm living testament to the moment that you face up to the bias that you're holding, you've got that magic bullet now. Your business takes off because you have set yourself free. Because it's our biases and these unconscious mindsets that are literally holding us back from the success that we're aiming for.
Powerful stuff.
Yes.
So who are the types of people that you're working with?
Okay, I'm working with business owners. Can I tell you a story about a couple of my clients?
You sure can.
Lovely. I've it's a smallish, 30 people in their staff, architecture firm. And they approached me about unconscious bias training because they'd had someone come in and present diversity and inclusion training. They were so bad that after an hour, they asked the trainer to leave. And then they approached me because they felt that I was going to be able to deliver what they wanted. I felt such a huge amount of trust being given to me that after such a bad experience that they were even willing to look at some sort of training in this area again. I also work with sporting organisations. I've just kick-started unconscious bias training for a very large national sporting body here in Australia. Now, they approached me because they, a bit like the architecture company, they didn't know what they didn't know, and they were willing to admit that. And when they came to me, they said, look, we want to do unconscious bias training, but we just don't know where to start. Now, this national sporting body has over 600 staff. So we've gone from, small business, small to medium-sized business, through to a really large national sporting body. And again, the level of trust that I see them giving me, that I can bring to them the understanding. And initially, much of it is about building awareness. What is bias? How does it form? How does it turn up in the workplace? And I've got a free giveaway, which a PDF of what bias can look like in the workplace, which I'd love to be able to give to your audience at the end of the podcast. So small businesses, sporting bodies. I'm also working with government departments here in Australia, because it doesn't, in a sense, it doesn't matter where you are on the business spectrum. Unconscious bias can and probably is of concern. And we might see it in the fact that there might be casual racism in the office, just little comments floating around, even like casual sexism, ageism, gossip that is separating people into groups. It's a whole lot of ways that we can see bias operating, but we haven't recognised it. And that's my job, to come in and help people see, look, this behaviour, this is telling you, this is the trigger that is telling you that bias is operating. Then the company, the organisation, department, they can then go and ask their own questions, find out what are the stories for the culture in my business, my workplace, and then work out what the biases are. And because they're now conscious, that's why my tagline is making bias conscious. Now that they're conscious, then you can do something with them.
When you come into an organization like that, do you feel like people are welcoming you with open arms, or are you noticing some resistance?
Lovely question. I love it, because I often hear three objections. The first one is, unconscious bias training doesn't work. The second is, people will say, we've put our staff through an online training, we're using an online training portal. One of the most interesting that I have heard was that management was concerned that unconscious bias training would make people feel vulnerable and might bring up some difficult emotions. And so, yes, so the short answer is yes, but I take people back to the analogy of riding a bike, which most of us learnt, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, that time of our lives. We didn't just get on the bike once, and then when we fell off or the handlebars wobbled, we decided that bike riding didn't work. We tried and tried again. And so it's really important to understand that any sort of awareness building, unconscious bias training, it can't just be a tick the box exercise that we do once, because these biases have been there. They're part of our thinking, part of how we view the world, and we need to look at them over again. But also, the people who are concerned about vulnerability and emotions are absolutely right. because unconscious bias training will bring up some uncomfortable emotions. We're actually going to have to look below the surface. But if you don't do this sort of training in a regulated manner, in a personal manner, with someone who is facilitating, doing the work from and understanding that, like myself, have done the work for themselves and are continuing to do that. If you just leave people to do it online, you have no idea what is happening for your staff. So to be able to do it in a much more holistic manner means that when those uncomfortable feelings, ideas come up, they can be addressed in a safe environment.
You just brought up a thought for me, which is an interesting phenomenon that even really committed people tend to, I'm going to say, fall prey to, which is we sometimes are going through the motions. So we learn a technique, we buy a book and we're reading through it, and we're sort of convincing ourselves that we're actually doing something productive. When we're really honest with ourselves, a lot of times we're not really doing the work. I oftentimes will say it's like giving lip service to it.
Yes.
And when your results are showing you that you're not really doing the work, you have to be very honest with yourself.
Yes.
A lot of times we want to avoid the uncomfortable things, but it's the uncomfortable things. And I'm not talking about stepping out of your comfort zone and, those type of rah-rah principles that are true to a certain extent as we're growing our businesses. I'm talking about the stuff within ourselves, the things that we've become very, very good at hiding from ourselves because we don't like that part of ourselves. We don't like that we have that belief. We want to be different, but we're not willing to do the inner work to create the shifts that need to occur to be the person we want to be. So as much as we are buying programs and reading books and doing the online courses, there comes a time when you've got to have a real heart-to-heart with yourself. And if you're not getting the results that you signed up for or that you intended to get from whatever that thing is, then there's a very high probability that you're not actually doing the work, and you do need to be willing to be vulnerable with yourself.
Yes. Yeah, one of my personal mantras is that the harder but better journey is the one within. And it is hard sometimes to do this. But I suppose I've been doing this inner work for so long now, it's become quite normal and natural. And I do hear those hesitations from people around doing the inner work. But I come back to what I have learned about myself is that I actually like myself a whole heap more because I understand myself better. And I think that's partly an age thing, but I know also, even when I was young, say 20 years younger, I felt more at home with myself because I understood myself better. And that's all inner work does, is it helps us understand ourselves better, and we understand why we do what we do, why we get triggered by certain things. And so I always say to people that aren't you worth investing your time in? Like, you have already invested some money in, and often thousands of dollars in a program. or a course of books or, workbooks that you've said, yes, this is good, but you then haven't given yourself the time to look at yourself. Now, most of us do not have a monster living inside us. There isn't really any really bad, dark, nasty secrets that we don't know about. But there are some things that are holding us back, that are limiting how we view the world, that are getting in the way of us achieving the things that we want. We owe it to ourselves. We owe it to ourselves to do this work. And it doesn't have to be all done at once. That's why we get a lifetime.
And it doesn't matter where you are at in the lifetime. I always say it is better late than never. I remember
Absolutely.
when I had my general hypnotherapy practice and people would come to me for quitting smoking. It was such an eye-opening journey for me to be in that profession, because people would come in who had been addicted for, in some cases, 40 years. And it wasn't their first time trying to quit. And they would oftentimes be faced with deteriorating health and real self-confidence issues. And I would have to remind them, you can't change the past. Yeah, you can't take back all of those years, but better now than never. Better now than in another 5 years, another 10 years, another 20 years. How long are you going to make yourself suffer because of what you've done in the past? So embrace now, because from this moment forward, you can create a positive trajectory. And for those who are, because a lot of people have done quite a bit of inner work. A lot of people listening to this probably have been on a personal development journey to some extent. Or maybe in some cases, and it's not uncommon, I've had clients come to me, they've been in business for 30 plus years and have done pretty well for themselves, just grinding away. But they know that they could have gone so much further if they would have done the inner work. And one day you wake up and you're like, oh my gosh, but better late than never.
Yes. Yeah, so, indeed. So, and it's never too late.
Right. Exactly. It's not. I mean, even if I were on my deathbed, I would still rather be going through an internal process of releasing and shifting and forgiveness and letting go and loving myself than wait until I'm on the other side and be like, oh, damn.
Too late now.
So, Bron, can you share with our listeners how they can get in contact with you?
Certainly. You can go to my website, which is bronwilliams.com. My email is info@bronwilliams.com. I like to keep things nice and simple. But also, I do a lot of work on LinkedIn. So go and find me. I'm Bron Williams, the bias specialist on LinkedIn. I've got lots of information there and I'd love to connect with you.
Excellent. This has been a fantastic episode. A lot of good takeaways here. Right. Powerful, powerful tools for transformation that people really can begin to implement if they're willing to do the inner work.
Yes, they are. They can.
So I want to thank you so much, Bron, for sharing your wisdom and your energy with us.
Thank you.
And I want to thank all of our listeners. You're the reason we're doing this. So Thank you so much for tuning in to another fantastic episode. If you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe. So many great conversations and incredible experts sharing just solid game-changing information. So, until next time, thank you.